Hello, and welcome to your second data visualization lecture. Now that you know the basics of ggplot/plot9, I really want to talk about those things that I mentioned in the very first lecture about how to do effective data visualization. Because like I said, it's not really about you knowing how to make a box plot or knowing how to get rid of a background. It's about you genuinely thinking about the message that you're trying to communicate and making sure that your graph supports that. I think it's really important to remember throughout this entire lecture that there's no one-size-fits-all rules. I wish I could give you rules that when you have this type of data for this type of audience that you have to do X, Y, and Z, but it's just so context dependent that I can't give you those hard and fast rules. What I can do is walk you through an example of all of the different questions that I think are helpful to ask when doing effective data visualization, and at least give you a taste of what that could look like. So first, I'm going to load my data because, of course, the most important part of a data visualization is that you have data. Now, this is just a review of what I already had on my slides. These are some questions that I want you to ask yourself when you're making data visualizations. The first thing is, what is the message that I'm trying to communicate? Now, in this specific graph that I'm going to make, we're going to use the penguin data, and we're going to answer the question, are penguin species different in bill length? Let's just go ahead and make the default ggplot graph for this to see what the answer is. So as before, we're going to say ggplot penguins AES X equals, oops, not capital, species, Y equals bill length mm. Now, as before, we actually made a similar plot in the last lecture. We're going to add geom box plot, and hopefully this will help us see what the answer to our question and the thing that we'll be trying to communicate actually is. Beautiful. Okay, so as we saw in the last lecture, the chinstrap penguins have the highest bill length, with Gen 2 penguins somewhere in the middle. And again, I should really learn how to pronounce this, the Adelie penguins with the lowest bill length overall. Now, this is just the default graph that ggplot gave us. Let's think about, as we go through all of these questions, what are things that we can change or improve about this graph to make the answer to our question, which is which penguins have, or like, do the penguins have different bill lengths, more understandable from this graph. Now, I'm just going to go and copy and paste what we have here, but I want to say, okay, well, what are things that we can maybe add to our graph to make it a little more understandable? One thing that we looked at before is adding color to distinguish the different groups. Now, I can either do this in the ggplot function or in the geom boxplot function. I'm going to do it in the general ggplot function, but I'm going to say fill equals species, and this is going to give us a different color for each of our species. Let's go ahead and run this. Beautiful. So same graph, just now there's color. And I think that the color really helps communicate that these are different species or different groups that we're contrasting. Because the colors that we're using are very different, we can see that the species are very different, and that the message that we're trying to convey is there are different species and their bill lengths are different. So adding the color really helps with that. Next, another thing that we could add to our graph is a title. Right now, you would have to be aware of the exact context of the question we're asking and the data we're working with to really grasp what's going on in this graph. But adding a title can be really helpful for people who are coming in who don't know a lot about this data set or don't even know that we're talking about penguins. One of the ways that we can add this is by using the ggtitle function. So we can go ahead and add that and say ggtitle, and then give it a title that is thoughtful and descriptive and really supports the message that we're trying to communicate. In this case, I'm going to choose something like, do penguins how about do penguin species have different bill lengths? And this really gives the reader of the graph an idea about what we're actually doing. Oh, I forgot to add the fill, so we'll say fill equals species. And let's go ahead and run that. Beautiful. So now we've added something to our graph to help it be a little bit clearer in terms of the message that we're trying to send. Now let's go ahead and add maybe at least one more thing. So when we're making our graph, the title really helped. But another thing that could really help in terms of changing or adding things is relabeling our X and Y axes. Right now, they're just named what the column names in our data frame are, but that's not, one, pretty, and two, something that would be easily understandable. I want someone to be able to glance at this graph and understand the message that I'm trying to convey, and changing the X and Y axis labels will just really help support that message. So let's go ahead and add them. We can add X and Y labels, or at least change X and Y labels, by using the labs function. And actually, we could have set our title inside the labs function too, but we'll get to that later. For now, I'm going to say X equals, and I'm going to capitalize species because it kind of helps draw the eye to that word more. And then in terms of the Y axis, I'm going to have that say bill length in millimeters. So now let's go ahead and run this, and you can see, again, very similar graph. We're just making incremental changes here, but the X and Y axis labels are a lot more clear. They draw the eye more, and I think they communicate our message better. Now, one point I really want to make, because I think it is so important and in my eyes kind of exciting, is that the context of the audience that you're using or that you're talking to really might change the way that you're effectively communicating this information. Now, right now, I have this beautiful graph that has species as the x-axis label. But let's imagine that I am presenting to a group of people that is very familiar with penguins, knows instantly by looking at it that Gentoo, Chinstrap, and Adelaibe are species of penguins. One thing that I could do is get rid of the x-axis label. And I did that by giving the x-axis label an empty string. Now you can see that we've removed some ink from our graph. If we're talking to an audience who would instantly recognize these words as species of penguin, we don't necessarily need to use up the ink on our graph to tell them that it's a different species. This is just a really great example that the rules of data visualization aren't static. It depends on your message and it depends on who you're presenting to. Because if you're presenting to, say, a group of kindergartners who are really excited to learn about penguins, they're not going to know that Gentoo is a type of penguin unless you told them. And so you may want to include that x-axis species label. Whereas with experts, your message is actually maybe hindered by that label because you're adding extra visual information that doesn't give them any actual useful information that supports the message that you're creating. Now that we've talked about adding things to help make the message that we're trying to do more clear, let's talk about how we can remove things to make our graph more efficient, effective, and clear. If you've ever heard that really silly rule of every time you get ready, you should look at yourself in the mirror and take off 2 accessories that you have on, that's sort of the way that I want you to think about graphs. I always want you to be asking, why is this element of my graph here? Is it useful? Is it supporting the message that I'm trying to convey? So let's think about what we can do with the current graph that we have in order to make it more effective in the message that it's communicating. One thing that we already removed is the species label. Let's assume we're presenting to experts, so we don't need that label. Taking it away actually made the message of our graph a lot more clear, at least to that audience. Now, one of my favorite ways to start removing things in order to increase the clarity and efficiency of my graph is to add one of those themes that I was talking about. My absolute favorite to use as a default is theme_minimal because it just gets rid of a lot of that visual clutter that exists in the default ggplot graphs. So let's go ahead and add the theme, but in essence, remove some visual information from our graph and see how that improves the clarity and the effectiveness of the message that we're trying to communicate, which again, just to remind you, is the fact that penguin species have different bill lengths. Awesome. I think that's already a huge improvement. If you see from the graph above, there's a lot less visual clutter, and actually we've increased the contrast of the graph. Before, the contrast between the light gray background and the colors was a little bit less stark than the contrast between bright colors and a white background. I think this really helped improve our graph and doesn't waste ink in the sense that we are not putting visual color or visual information in a place where it doesn't really serve any purpose. Cool. Now let's think about what other things we can get rid of. And to be honest, depending on the context, literally almost any part of your graph is something that in some context it's appropriate to get rid of. But I just want to talk about some that are pretty common, at least in the graphs that I've seen. One thing that we can think about is the grid lines that we have in the back. Now, grid lines are sometimes useful. It helps go from the x-axis label, or excuse me, the y-axis labels and the x-axis labels, and draws across the entire graph so that we can keep constant track of what our values are. But in this case, on the x-axis at least, the values are just categories. They're species of penguins, and we don't really need a grid line for that. And so getting rid of the x-axis grid lines, I think will actually add clarity to our graph, because instead of having to look at lines that don't actually give us any information, we'll just have white space or less visual clutter. The way that we do this is with the theme function, and this is slightly different than the theme minimal that we just added, but we'll say plus theme, and then we'll say panel underscore grid underscore major underscore x equals element underscore blank. Now, let me explain every part of that to you just so that you understand, but I am kind of operating on the assumption that you're going to have to look up some of the ggplot/plot9 documentation when you're building your own graphs. But to give you an idea of what this is saying, it's saying panel, which is like the background of the graph, the grid, which is our grid lines, the major grid lines, so the bigger, thicker ones, and on the x-axis. So it's saying, let's get rid of them. Element blank means get rid of them. I don't want to see them. So when we do this, we're basically saying, get rid of all the major grid lines in our graph. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Oh, beautiful. I think it looks much better already. In fact, I think that that really cleared up some of the visual space so that you can just focus on the message, which is different species of penguins have different bill lengths. Let's think about what else we could remove. Here is a time when you really have to focus on the message, because different messages require different elements of your graph. In this case, let's pretend that the exact message that I want to communicate is just the penguins have different bill lengths. I don't necessarily care that my audience knows exactly in millimeters what the different bill lengths are for each species. I just want them to understand that between the species there are differences in bill length. So I can actually remove a lot of different things from my graph. Maybe the first and most obvious one is this legend that says species over here. Since we have x-axis labels, we don't actually need this legend here. It's communicating redundant information that no one actually needs to see twice. And it's just taking up ink. So let's go ahead and remove that. I'm going to copy the plot that we have from before and then show you how to do that. Okay, so the way that we're going to do this, and actually a lot of what we're going to do in this section of the graph, is we're going to go back to the theme function, and we're going to say legend underscore position equals the string none, which essentially tells ggplot that I don't want to see this legend over here. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Oh, better already. I think it's less clutter, less visual information, and I'm not actually losing any information. That legend didn't really tell me anything that I didn't already know. Now, the fact that I only want people to get the message that the different penguin species have different bill lengths means that I can actually probably get rid of my y-axis grid lines as well. Now, I want to caution you, don't get rid of everything. If it's important to you that your audience knows what the approximate median or range of bill lengths is for each species, you absolutely should leave these grid lines in and leave the labels of 40, 50, and 60 millimeters in, because it's important and it's a way that you're communicating your specific message. But my message is just that different species have different bill lengths. So I don't actually care that my audience knows exactly what that bill length is. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of both the major, and they're a little bit faint, so I don't know if you can see them, but the minor grid lines. And I'm actually also going to get rid of these numbers on the left-hand side. Since I don't care what the actual value is, I just want to visually show that there's a difference. They're not really necessary here. And this is the point at which it gets kind of hard. I want to make a really good graph and I want it to be effective, but I have to be really careful that I'm not removing things that actually would support the message I'm trying to communicate. In this case, I've really thought deeply about it and I realize all I care is there is a difference, not exactly what the values are. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. The way that I'm going to do that is really similar to how I got rid of the other grid lines. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste that twice. And instead of major, I'm going to put minor, because I also want to get rid of the minor y-axis. And then I'm going to get rid of this x, change that to a y. So if you review here, this is saying get rid of the major x, the minor y, and the major y grid lines. Similarly, I want to get rid of these labels that I have. And the way that I do that is by saying axis underscore text underscore y. So that's saying the text on the axis of the y-axis, get rid of it. So I'm going to say another element underscore blank. Okay, so now I've gotten rid of so many things in my graph. Let's see how it looks. Oh, beautiful. I love this. We're using so much less ink than we were previously. In fact, if I just scroll up, you can see how visually cluttered our earlier graphs were compared to this tapered down, very tailored graph that specifically communicates the message that we want to communicate, which is there's a difference between the species in terms of bill lengths. Okay, so now that we've added and removed things in order to make our message very clear, let's think a little bit about accessibility. Now, accessibility comes in so many different shapes and sizes, and all of the different ways that you can make your graph accessible are incredibly important. I can't cover all of them here. I'm sure there's even ones that I'm not aware of, but I want to cover some common ones that you can always be asking yourself to make sure that your graphs are accessible. Let's go ahead and copy the graph we made before. And let's think about people who are colorblind. Now, the colorblind often have trouble distinguishing between different colors. There's actually different types of color blindness, so you might want to be cognizant of that. But I want to show you this colorblind friendly palette that someone made. And if you Google colorblind friendly color palette, so many different options will pop up that people have research-based chosen colors that people with different types of color blindness can distinguish. Now, this is a really great color palette because the difference between all the colors is more easily seen by people who have color blindness. So while the colors that I used are actually really bright and easy to distinguish, at least for us, I want to make sure that my palette that I'm using is colorblind friendly. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these hex strings and copy them into my code so that I can use those colors for my graph. I'll see you in 1 second once I've copied and pasted those. Awesome. Okay, let me walk over what I did with the colors for you. So you can see that I added something here. I added a function called scale fill manual. And this is basically saying for that fill aesthetic that I've added to my graph, allow me to specifically choose manually the colors that I want you to use. And I've given it a list of all of the different hex codes from this website that had the colorblind friendly color palette. So this basically tells it, instead of this red, green, and blue, use the colorblind friendly colors. Forgot a parenthesis. Now let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Beautiful. So we have the same graph as above, but now we're using colors that, at least according to this color palette, are easily distinguishable but for people who are colorblind. Now, another thing that we have to think about when thinking about accessibility is visual impairment. If you look at the plots that we're using, they're not horrible, but the default font sizes for everything and line sizes are incredibly small. If you have any type of visual impairment, I mean, ask your grandparents to try and read some of your graphs. It's going to be really hard to read, especially the species of penguin, but pretty much anything on our graph. One thing we can do to keep accessibility in mind is make sure that the fonts and the sizes that we're using are appropriate for the context of our graph. In this case, I think we have a lot of room to increase the size of the fonts to make sure that 1, they're easily noticeable, and 2, for people with any visual impairment, that they're still able to read them. Now that we've talked about color blindness, let's talk a little bit about visual impairment. And I want to break down more specifics because there's different kinds of visual impairment and different ways that we can address it. One thing that we might want to think about is contrast. Are we putting different colors that are very similar on top of or next to each other and expecting people to know that they're different objects or different groups or something like that? Increasing contrast is a really good way to communicate messages when part of your message is these things are different. One of the main ways that we can see this is in the background, and we actually did a really good job of this just by adding our theme minimal earlier in the process. The white background is a really great contrast to the darker, more saturated colors that we use to fill our box plots. So I'm not going to add anything here because we've already done an A+ job with contrast, but it's always something to be thinking about when you're making graphs. The next thing that we can be thinking about is shapes. So if you have some kind of color blindness or any other real visual impairment that makes it really difficult to see the difference between the colors that we've used in our fill for our box plots, one thing you can do is add, quote, redundant information to your graph. For instance, because one of the ways that we're using color is to distinguish the different species of penguins, we can add another element that has a non-color way of communicating that. We could fill our box plots with a pattern, although I'm not sure that that's actually available in plot 9, although it is in ggplot and R. Another thing that we could do is add raw data points and have different shapes for the data points per species. The way that we would do that is by adding another geom point, like we did in the previous lecture. And then inside geom point, we'd say AES shape equals species. And this will allow us to have the raw data plotted on our box plot and for the shape to be different for each of our species. Now, even though if you look at this and see, oh, well, I feel like that's redundant, I don't want to use up ink. Well, sure, and it's definitely a balance you have to think about. But in this case, I think it's a really great way to add information that is actually not redundant to some people in order to better think about accessibility and make sure that your message, which is species are different, is clearly understandable to everyone. Now, the last and maybe the most common thing that I want to talk about in terms of accessibility, again, this isn't meant to be exhaustive, but one thing I often see is the fact that the default graphs in ggplot or matplotlib or really any plotting package makes everything so small. It makes lines really thin, it makes fonts really small, and that's not a great way to make sure we're supporting accessibility. So one thing that we can do is look at our graph and go, what could we make more bold, more prominent, bigger in order to help people that maybe have mild visual impairment? If you ask like your grandparents or someone you know that has some kind of visual impairment, you can even ask them and say, can you read this? Is it clear to you? And then change those things to make sure you're including a wide range of people in the group of people that can really appreciate the message that you're trying to send with your graph. Like most things, the way that we're going to change this is inside the theme function. And the way that we're going to change this is we're going to say axis underscore text underscore x. So this is saying change the axis text on the x-axis. And we're going to say element text because it's a text element, and we're going to say size equals, and I'm going to make this size 12 font, and let's just see what that does to our graph. Beautiful. Oh my goodness, I can see the contrast so much better in terms of what the species are. I think this will make it easier not only for people with visual impairment, but really anyone to make sure that they can read the species labels on the x-axis. I'm going to go ahead and change the axis text as well as the title text to also be a little bit bigger. I've gone ahead and added some extra things so that the title, the Y text, and the X text are bigger font sizes. Another thing that you can think of in terms of size to make sure your graph is accessible is to increase the size of things like our shapes. Right now they're really tiny and it kind of makes them hard to see. And if they're an important way that we're trying to communicate that the different species are different, we can increase their size in order to make them a little more visible. We want to do this inside the individual geom for the points. So inside geom point, we're going to add an argument called size and we're going to set it equal to 3. And that's going to make our shapes a little bit bigger. Let's see what our graph looks like now that we've added all of these resizing elements. Beautiful. The shapes are so much easier to see, and now so is the title and the Y and X axes. I'm going to stop here, but I think we could go on forever, adding and removing things, making sure that our message was clear. But at least for the question that we were trying to answer or communicate, which is the different penguin species have different bill lengths, I think we did a really good job. We thought about accessibility, we thought about communication, and we thought about who our audience was. And I think our graph looks beautiful and very clear. Now, the last thing was a little harder to touch on in this graph, but the other thing that you want to think about in terms of accessibility is culture. Different people have different cultural contexts, and if you're using something like slang, images, colors that mean something in your culture but may not mean the same thing in another culture, you want to make sure that you are thinking about that and thinking about ways that you can overcome the deficits that might occur when using those culturally contextual items. One really silly example is we often see the colors red, green, and blue as stop, wait, and go. If for some reason you had an audience member who had never seen a traffic light and never gotten the association of red, green, and yellow that we do, you might want to think about that, because if you're trying to use the color red to mean stop and the color green to mean go, that's not going to be intuitive to them as it would be from someone of the same culture as you. These are just really important things to think about to make sure that your graph is communicating the same message to people across all cultures that you are talking to. Now, I've said it once and I will say it again. I can't teach you hard and fast rules for being an effective data visualizer. I wish I could. I would probably make a lot of money and I could probably teach an entire class on it, but I just can't. There's no static rules. It all depends on your message, the context that you're working in, and even a little bit on the data that you're working with. What I want you to take away from this is not how to make a graph that tells you that different species of penguins have different bill lengths. That's really not going to be applicable in your daily life or your future career ever. But what I do want you to take away is all of the questions that we asked ourselves throughout this process to make sure that the data visualization that we created was effective. I want you to ask yourself these questions whenever you're making a data visualization. And I will put the caveat that if you're just trying to really quickly plot data for you to see the data, if you're exploring a new data set, I'm not saying that you have to make perfect data visualization all the time. What I am saying is when you're making a data visualization that someone else is going to see, make sure you're being thoughtful. Think about the message that you're trying to convey and think about how you can make that message more effective. Can you make it more accessible? Can you make it more clear? What can I add and what can I take away to make sure that the people viewing my chart are going to understand the message that I intend for them to understand? Hopefully you enjoyed this process, and I will see you next time.